fair statement?
I'd say that's a fair statement.
And Mr. Horowitz?
Yes.
Mr. Smith?
The breakdown of our criminal investigations is roughly 45% UI-based and the other 55% SBA, but that's just a Secret Service context, just to give you what we have open.
No, but the UI was extended under the CARES Act when President Trump was president. And by the way, the Democrats objected back then to a lot of the deregulation on SBA and a lot of the deregulation on how that was administered. But I just want to be clear, because they're trying to imply that somehow this fraud, which in my view is it's less than 2 to 3%. I mean, you can't say it, but even if you think that it was $100 billion, that's still less than a couple percent of the total spending. They're trying to imply that somehow President Biden is to blame for that. And that, you would agree, is just not factual, correct? I mean, you can't blame President Biden and not blame President Trump when 3.3 trillion of it was under Trump. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at the totality of the programs from 2020 to the current day, and we're finding problems across that whole spectrum.
Mr. Horowitz?
Yes. The fraud began in March 2020. We're looking at fraud cases throughout. Most of the money went out in the earlier periods of time, but there's fraud throughout.
That's a great point. Most went out earlier. So if anything, the Trump administration probably is more to blame for that 3% of the fraud. Let me ask this to Mr. Dodaro. One of the challenges has been the antiquated IT systems in many of these states prior to the pandemic. And this is actually one of the challenges with the unemployment claims. Could you compare Republican-led state performances on these IT systems versus Democratic states, or talk more generally about these IT systems?
Well, I can talk generally. I can't. We didn't look at it that way. We don't look at things on a partisan basis. But the IT systems, some of them date back to the 1970s, from what we understand. There are efforts made to try to modernize them. You know, we keep a list of the highest risk areas. This is at the federal level for the federal government. IT acquisitions and operations on the high risk list government-wide for the federal government. At the state level, they were having similar problems, and that contributed to their inability to detect some of the fraud. They weren't able to do matching on some cases in some of the larger states, and with the volume of claims that came through, they needed to have automated processes. In some states, they were doing it manually, you know, visually, just trying to.
That was one of the big reasons for the fraud, right?
That was a contributing factor, yes. And the other contributing factor was self-certifications. And the self-certifications, I think, was one of the biggest contributing factors, where the people could just say, I'm eligible for this program. In some cases, they weren't allowed and not required to submit supporting documentation, so you just had to take people's word for it. And that's a prescription for fraud.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is working now. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And I've got to tell you, in sitting here and watching you be still for as many hours as you did at our age is a real test of stamina. So you have my respect. You're going to have to tell me how you do that sometime. I want to shift gears just a little bit. We talked about fraud and waste and abuse quite a bit. I'd like to turn the conversation, if we may, just for a couple of minutes, to government efficiency. Through the pandemic, I have observed across all industries, because of the loss of workforce, and we could get into the reasons for that. That's a whole series of hearings, I'm sure. But every industry that I talk to seems to have been forced to reinvent itself through the pandemic, and now that the pandemic is coming to a close. And by reinvent itself, I'm talking about doing more or the same job with fewer people. In serving as an appropriations chair for the state of North Carolina immediately before I got here, it occurs to me because every state agency that was coming to me asking for their appropriation for the following year was asking for more, not less. And I'm just curious what you might be seeing, or are you in a position to comment on, has government been able in any way to reinvent itself? This Congress is on the cusp of having to make some really critical decisions to raise the debt limit, to change our spending trajectory. And I'd like to know that government is working as hard to reinvent itself and do more with less, just like every other industry out there is doing. Do you have any evidence or commentary on that observation?
Yeah. I don't know if I'd put it in the category of reinventing itself, but for 11 years now, I issue an annual report to the Congress on overlap, duplication, and fragmentation in the federal government and how to achieve cost savings and perhaps revenue enhancements. And we've issued almost 1,300 recommendations over that period of time. About half of those recommendations have been fully implemented, some partially implemented. To date, there have been financial benefits to the government of over $500 billion, $565 billion. So there are efforts underway, and there are hundreds of other GAO recommendations we have open yet that haven't been implemented that could save tens of billions of additional dollars. Right now, we probably have around 5,000 recommendations implemented. I'll be issuing that report again this spring. And we also have the high-risk list that I referenced earlier in areas in need of transformation. And that program over the last 15 years has saved $675 billion. So there are improvements being made. They're difficult to effectuate, but there's much more that could be done for government to do that. And I think congressional oversight's been key. Where there has been progress, it's been through congressional action for the big dollars.
Thank you. I'll be waiting on that report. That'll be my favorite read this spring. One other quick question. I know from chairing oversight of unemployment in North Carolina, the federal government had this process where they came back and asked for unemployment funds that had already been appropriated through a process called sequestration. Are you familiar with that? And if so, can you tell me nationwide how many dollars were sequestered, and of that, how many were actually recollected from the states?
Yeah. I'm not familiar specifically with the unemployment insurance program. The only sequestration I'm familiar with was due to the Budget Control Act of 2011. And by there, the Congress set limits on discretionary spending. And if the appropriation bills didn't come down to those levels, there was an across-the-board government cut to bring them down to those levels. That happened in 2013 and 2014. And it was like equivalent of, if my memory serves me right, about 7% cut at that time.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you very much.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, members of the committee, and of course, gentlemen on the panel, thank you for your time today. I want to take this opportunity at the start of this Congress and this committee's first hearing to say how honored I am to serve on this committee and to join in the oversight of this committee's work. As a New Mexican and as an American, I am deeply proud to serve our country and to serve our communities and to serve under the leadership of our ranking member in particular, Mr. Jamie Raskin, who is a hero and a scholar here in the House. Our job on this committee is to defend our democracy and our basic institutions, to protect our rights as Americans, and as a member of the Truth Squad on this side of the aisle, to hold our government accountable and counter the lies, conspiracy theories, and extremism that we're going to hear on this committee, this Congress. In a couple of words, we're here to fight for the American people and for the people of New Mexico, which is where I was born and raised. And in fact, I'm grateful for this discussion today because as a native New Mexican and as somebody who grew up in a working family that struggled to make ends meet with a single mother, I personally know what it means to live on the edge and why critical relief programs like the programs that we're talking about here today in this committee were passed by this body to help millions of Americans who would have fallen through the cracks as we saw in previous economic disruptions. In fact, the early relief programs, whether that's the insurance, the PPP program, the subsequent American Recovery Plan, literally saved lives. Let me say that again. These programs saved lives. In fact, in New Mexico, almost 93,000 New Mexicans received unemployment insurance. When the pandemic began, I was serving in the state legislature. We called thousands of New Mexicans in my district to find out how they were doing welfare checks. Elders who were stranded in their homes without access to health care. People whose family members had died. People who were unable to get food and water, especially in our rural and tribal communities. These programs were designed to save lives and to keep individuals from falling into the free fall of economic disaster during a pandemic. We know there was fraud and abuse. There is fraud and abuse wherever there are humans who take advantage of systems that do not have proper oversight. I know a lot about oversight. I used to work in the Office of Management and Budget in this government. I was a Senate staffer. I conducted financial oversight. I know what that looks like. And I have never seen more financial fraud and abuse of the system than I saw in the previous administration under Donald Trump, in which financial systems were abused, including by his cronies and fraudsters who were involved in his administration and his friends across the country. And our job is to make sure that they are held accountable and that we are looking out for the people in our communities. So let's get the story straight. I know, gentlemen, you've been here a long time today, many, many hours. I know you're ready probably to go take a break and rest, and we thank you for your time this morning, for serving our country and the roles that you all play in doing that oversight. But I want to just ask a couple of few questions to clarify what is going on. So, Mr. Dorado, I know you've talked a lot this morning and probably answered this question in multiple ways, but I want to be very specific. Can you tell us how many convictions and guilty pleas have come from federal charges regarding fraud with these COVID relief programs?
Yes. So far, according to the Department of Justice system, there have been over 1,000 people who've either pled guilty or have been convicted. There's another 600 people where charges are pending. There are hundreds of investigations underway now, and will be done. Of the 1,000 people who've been guilty or
Thank you, Mr. Dodoro.
Right.
I want to just clarify. So we're talking less than 2,000 people, and we're talking about millions of Americans whose lives were impacted by these programs. 93,000 New Mexicans and less than 3,000 cases of fraud and abuse. Now, we need to hold those who committed crimes accountable, and that's exactly what we're going to do on this committee through the oversight of our federal programs who are tasked with that role, and our law enforcement and our court system. But our job is to make sure that the American people are represented and we keep this government accountable. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Langworthy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for their long testimony here today and your patience. This is an interesting topic for me because I was a victim of unemployment fraud, and my prior role is chairman of the New York State Republican Party, and a fraudster and a criminal applied for unemployment insurance in my name. through a previous address that I hadn't lived at for over 10 years. The Erie County District Attorney in my community also was a victim in the same fashion, where a fraudster used his name and very public profile to apply for unemployment insurance. So it was a very prevalent problem in my state, and reports indicate that billions of taxpayer dollars have been wasted due to mismanagement, fraud, and inefficient processes by the government throughout this entire pandemic. You know, when a stock brokerage loses billions of dollars of their customers' investments, the brokerage itself is blamed. However, when government does this, it's swept under the rug. The government should not be excused for losing money on this extraordinary level. Mismanagement and indiscretion to this degree is unacceptable, and it's an absolute disservice to the hardworking taxpayers that have entrusted their dollars, their hard-earned money, to this government. So, Mr. Dodaro, in my home state of New York, a report from the Department of Labor showed that throughout the state fiscal year of 2021, government wasted an estimated $11 billion of taxpayer money. The primary reason for this waste is the New York State Department of Labor was using outdated technology that it was recommended to replace not once, not twice, beginning in 2010 and again in 2015. So, Mr. Dodaro, I'd like to ask you, are there other agencies in the federal government or any state governments, to your knowledge, whose outdated technology has led to wasted taxpayer dollars to that extent? And if so, would you mind mentioning who they are?
The problems with the IT systems were affected a number of states. And I don't, to what extent, and compared to New York, I'm not able to talk about that at this time. I know there were similar problems in California, for example, and we're now looking at additional states, but it was a problem affecting a lot of states.
And it was federal money coming down to the states to make these programs whole. How in the future would we hold federal agencies and state governments accountable for failing to put in place mechanisms to reduce this risk of improper payment, or actually just being so porous to fraud as so many states like New York were?
Yeah, one way would be to make sure that they implement our recommendations that we've made by the GAO, the Inspector Generals, and state auditors. The figures that you quote on New York came from a state auditor's office. State auditors in other states, California, Kansas, and others, have issued reports as well. So one way is to make sure all those recommendations are implemented. Another way is to make sure that states certify that their systems meet certain standards and that there's appropriate independent verification that those systems are now able to meet certain standards. The Department of Labor should also provide some standards to the states, but each state has its own different system and eligibility requirements, so it has to be tailored to the individual states.
Are there any mechanisms or penalties available to the federal government to prevent this sort of thing from happening again with states that won't listen to the guidance?
Not to my knowledge right now. They would have to be instituted, and I think it would be good to be able to do that.
I mean, it seems like we put ourselves in a pretty feckless position as a federal government if we, continue to allow states to ignore guidance that has been leveled on them, especially large populous states, that have a population that's open to that much unemployment benefit. We can all agree that there are losses to the tune of $500 billion is unacceptable. I think everybody in this room can agree to that. We can't allow this to occur again. We have to be way better stewards of the taxpayer dollar and take that responsibility much more seriously. But I thank you very much for your time here, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Burleson.
From Missouri. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
My apologies. I'm sorry. The O looks like a D on my list here. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I'm very honored to serve on House Oversight Committee this Congress, and I'd like to thank the chair for the hard work that he's been doing on this committee. I look forward to working with each one of my colleagues here in the 118th Congress. My question is to Mr. Horowitz. On Monday, Senator Ernst revealed that thousands of federal employees have double-dipped on taxpayers and applied for pandemic unemployment assistance in addition to receiving their federal paycheck. Just as a personal note, business owners and working families in Southwest Missouri, which is not exactly the richest part of the nation, struggled quite a bit during the pandemic, and their livelihoods were threatened. And yet federal employees had the comfort of a government paycheck, yet there's evidence that thousands of these federal employees may have falsely claimed that they lost their job. My first question is, how is this even possible? Was there nothing in place to cross-check these employees, or do we just pay out the benefits to whomever it applies?
So that one of the challenges is in fact the absence of cross-checking of information, and that has been a problem across programs. I am aware of Senator Ernst's letter, and we're following up on that. We have done that, for example, at DOJ. I've looked at some of these issues, and we can look at it. It takes a fair amount of time once you get the hits to figure out actually whether there are fraud cases or not, because there are spouses who potentially were eligible. We've identified where there's addresses. It turns out there are apartment buildings, so we then have to figure out who else is in that building, whether that address is a hit or not. So there are things we need to do to make sure we've got the right number ultimately, but it's an important issue, and we're going to follow up on it.
Before I forget, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the letter from Senator Ernst to the Honorable Michael Horowitz.
Thank you. The chair recognizes,
Sir.
oh, without objection. My apologies.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, in your report to Congress last fall, you said that the PRAC was working to identify active federal employees who applied for PPP, and that so far you had matched tens of thousands of employees with SBA loans for which they were not eligible. Do you have any updates on that analysis?
We've matched the numbers, and that's what I was mentioning to you. We are working through, for example, in my office, we do have cases that are moving forward as a result of that, but it has taken a considerable amount of time to get from the large number to the smaller number because of the absence of particularized data. The challenge has been agency data not being sufficient to immediately figure this out.
Do you have an estimated, like an ETA, as when you might have the results?
Well, when we find a case, we start investigating it. We're working with our law enforcement partners at that point, and hopefully those cases will end up being prosecuted.
And then what actions have we taken, if any, or what actions will be taken? I guess if you could answer both. What has been taken against federal employees who might have applied for unemployment benefits fraudulently, and what actions would be taken? We're
going to pursue those cases to the fullest extent possible, including seeking prosecutions, working with our law enforcement partners on it. I can give you an example. We have several on the PPP idle side. For example, a relatively higher level person at NASA agency was sentenced to a considerable number of years in prison. He worked in their financial office, who had engaged in, I can't remember whether it was PPP or idle fraud, but
that's disturbing.
So we're pursuing those cases.
That's good to know. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, before I forget, earlier we heard from Congressman Donalds about an article from Politico that the Biden administration had rerouted billions in emergency stockpile to funds for the border. And I seek unanimous consent to enter this into the record.
Yes, Mr. Burleson from Missouri, without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentle lady from Georgia, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to bring up something that was spoken about earlier by one of my Democrat colleagues on the panel. There we go. Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to bring up something that was brought up by one of our Democrat colleagues on this panel about Republican members of Congress taking PPP loans. I never took one as a member of Congress, but as a business owner, I did take a PPP loan in order to be able to pay my employees. And I'm so thankful I was able to do that because they would have lost their jobs. And I think it's important to recognize. But the minority side of our committee here is having a witness on the next panel that had said that she didn't, or her, or any of her affiliates take any federal grants or contracts related to this hearing's subject matter. But in fact, as executive director of the National Employment Law Project, they took over $825,000 in PPP loans from the SBA. So that does need to be pointed out about the next panel witnesses. Here we are, a nation that our government spent over $5 trillion in COVID relief funding, and we can't find $560 billion, I believe, of that money of the Americans' hard-earned taxpayer funding. We're also a nation at $34 trillion in debt, and we're on the verge of having to handle our debt ceiling, raise it once again. And here we are looking at waste, fraud, and abuse. And gentlemen, I thank you for coming and speaking to our committee on this issue. I know it's been a long day for you. But I would like to ask some questions about the type of funding that has been used with COVID relief funds, and it's pretty shocking to me. You know, I read some examples. For example, Washington, D.C.'s Mayor Muriel Bowser plans to use $31.5 million in American Rescue Plan funds to transition homes to green energy over the next 5 years. As many small businesses were shut down, children lost 2 years in education, child suicide rates went up, and it's hard to even imagine a child committing suicide. Many people died from COVID. Healthcare workers were fired from vaccine mandates. Many other people were fired because of vaccine mandates. And all the issues that have come out of COVID, I want to ask about how this money has been spent, because clearly there is a tremendous amount of waste, fraud, and abuse, and a lot of our hard-earned taxpayers' dollars spent on things that don't even make sense that they've been spent on. So, Mr. Dodaro, if you don't mind answering a few of my questions, can you tell me, as our comptroller of the United States, how much COVID cash was given to abortion?
I do not know that answer. I don't have that answer.
Oh, okay. So I can tell you Planned Parenthood clinics received $80 billion in COVID relief loans, which is hard to understand how that happened. Mr. Dodaro, can you tell me how much money COVID cash went towards diversity, equity, and inclusion or racism issues?
Again, we have not looked at that issue, so I don't know.
Oh, geez. Well, I can tell you the Pennsylvania Humanities Council did receive $1.4 million in relief and used it for equity and geographic diversity. I'm not sure how that helped in a pandemic time. Mr. Dodaro, can you tell me how much COVID cash went to CRT?
CRT?
Critical race theory in education. It's a racist curriculum used to teach children that somehow their white skin is not equal to black skin and other things in education.
Yeah. No, I do not know that, but I do know that there's provisions that the federal funds generally are not used, are supposed to be used for curriculum.
Oh.
That's a state.
Oh, Mr. Dodaro, I have to tell you, in Illinois, they received $5.1 billion at an elementary school there that used it for equity and diversity. So it's being used for these things. Mr. Dodaro, can you tell me how much money was given to Drag Queen Story Hour?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Who?
Drag Queen Story Time, where men dress up as women and read confusing books to children.
Yeah. First, I thought you said dry clean. So I'm sorry. No, I don't know the answer to either one of those two.
Oh, we need to look into this, and I urge you to do that. Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center in Pennsylvania received $16,000 for Drag Queen Story Time from COVID cash. I think this is an issue that needs to be looked into. A lot of this money went to things that it should have never gone to, and I thank you so much, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
I thank the chairman. Gentlemen, thanks for hanging in there. I know it's been a long day. Listen, I think it's important, a couple of things to acknowledge. A lot of these folks that were involved in this, the government took them out of their jobs, told them they couldn't go to work. Federal or state government couldn't run their businesses. And so there's a lot of people that this did a lot of good things for. And we all want to acknowledge that. There was a lot that was unknown. I don't agree with taking people out of their jobs or not allowing them to run their businesses, but that's another story for another day. The other thing that I just want to make a point, it's a personal sticking point for me. I don't see unemployment insurance. I see unemployment compensation. There's nothing insurance about this. There's no actuarials. There's no risk assessment to any of this, but that's a sticking point. But it becomes an entitlement for some folks. But in the interest of unemployment compensation, what I find interesting, among other things, is that according to a combination of estimates, $560 billion of the federal COVID relief funding may have either been lost to fraud or paid improperly. And while some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle condense that to a percentage of the overall and would kind of have us believe that it's acceptable because it's a small percentage of trillions of dollars, I don't know, $560 billion. I'm from a little town in Pennsylvania. That seems like a lot of money to folks like me. I imagine you feel the same way. An estimated, this is per ID me, an estimated 40%, that's nearly half of pandemic unemployment assistance funds, that's $400 billion, did not go to Americans and instead went to criminal gangs in Russia, China, and Nigeria. Now, I'm from Pennsylvania, and we've got our own particular problems there, and we can get into that, but a Nigerian crime ring named Scattered Canary was involved in submitting more than 2 million claims, 2 million claims from Nigeria. There's this other one, APT 41, and I know that you've all, it's been mentioned here before, talked about that, $20 million stolen unemployment comp. The scheme began in mid-2020 and spanned 2,000 accounts with more than 40,000 financial transactions. What in the Sam Hill is going on in our states? Like, the federal government gives the money to the states. They have an unemployment compensation system. So it's already up and running. So we're just adding some more fuel to them so that they can take care of these people that have been put out of work by their government. How are foreigners, like, do these states not see Nigeria, China, or some IP address that be associated with a foreign country and say, I wonder why foreign countries are getting unemployment compensation? Or, you know, do they fly back to work in America every day from Nigeria, from China, or from Russia? What, can you, I don't know, can you make sense of this to like a small country boy like me?
I don't think I can make sense of it, but I can tell you that it is one of the problems we've identified along the way, not just in the unemployment insurance program and others, that agencies aren't picking up the IP addresses for these applicants. Because the country was largely shut down, most of these applications came in electronically. And that is clearly one of the red flags. And something, by the way, as we get this data, we're going to be looking at is how many IP addresses were there associated with these various programs that were IP addresses from overseas.
I mean, some of the most egregious ones, Washington State, California, New York. I come from Pennsylvania. I've got a whole list here of infractions from the state that I'm proud to represent. These unemployment compensation systems have been around for a long time. So this is kind of in the past now, or maybe it's still ongoing, maybe they're not at the same level. What assurance can you give me or anybody else here that the states have addressed any of this so that it won't, like, maybe it's not happening at the same scale, but if it's happened here, it's probably continues to happen. What assurance can you give any of us and that this has been solved at this point, and why should the federal government give one more dime to any of these states that are allowing that? Look, we're looking at a debt ceiling increase. They want $2.6 trillion. We just talked about $500 billion just handed out to foreign criminals. What assurance can you give us moving forward that any of this is solved right now?
I'm not going to give you any assurance that it's solved right
Zero,
now.
is zero the right answer?
That's why this hearing is actually important, because there are, among other reasons, but there are fixes that need to happen. GAO's been talking about this for decades, and it's a fix. The Congress has to get involved, administration has to get involved, the states have to get involved, and we have to fix the problem.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, gentlemen, appreciate you.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to point out that my Republican colleagues are once again demonstrating the extreme lengths they will go to villainize reproductive freedom. Contrary to their allegations, Planned Parenthood health centers that received PPP loans were eligible nonprofit recipients consistent with the SBA's rules governing affiliation status and size. The Small Business Office of the Inspector General affirmed this conclusion in a September 2022 report that specifically determined Planned Parenthood health centers met PPP loan eligibility requirements. So I'd ask unanimous consent that the SBA OIG report be made part of the record, and I urge my Republican colleagues to cease their baseless, draconian attacks against the reproductive freedoms of people once and for all. And finally, the last point I want to make is just because you disagree with the spending doesn't mean that it is fraudulent, wasteful, or abusive. And with that, I yield back.
Without objection, it'll be entered into the record. The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not an attorney, and I'm not trying to do any gotcha. So if y'all want to give me just a yes or no, it'd be great. All right. Assistant Director Smith, in 2021, NBC reported that between $90 and $400 billion pandemic-related unemployment, U.S. taxpayers' dollars have been stolen, and half of that was taken by foreign criminals. Is this consistent with what your investigation revealed?
Sir, I can't validate that particular news piece. Which outlet did you say it was from?
Well, NBC News. It's been widely reported in other areas, but they were the biggest dog that wagged its tail on that, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not validating that.
Okay, okay. Well, the former Assistant Director of Investigation at the Secret Service, Jeremy Sheridan, called this theft, quote, the largest fraud scheme that I've ever encountered. And I guess what I'm getting at is that it seems to me it's clear that foreign and maybe some localized organized crime syndicates and other bad actors have perpetrated some crimes against the American taxpayers. Assistant Director Smith, do you agree with Mr. Sheridan, or have you ever encountered a larger fraud scheme?
I agree with former Assistant Director Sheridan's sentiments. The magnitude was made, the magnitude of pandemic-related fraud was what made it unique.
Do you think that in your professional capacity or otherwise that maybe some of these funds could be linked to terrorism organizations that these things would fund them?
Sir, I don't have any direct evidence linking terrorist organizations to pandemic relief funds, but as I mentioned earlier, it is not beyond the realm of possibility that, right, transnational criminal organized groups of various sorts.
And drugs and human trafficking, all those dirt bags that kind of run together, I guess.
Yes, sir. The group I mentioned earlier, Black Axe out of Nigeria, they involved themselves in human trafficking, drug trafficking, the full gamut. So that they were also involved in pandemic-related.
All right, and thank you. Comptroller, Mr. Dodaro. Did I say that name right? I get it? Pretty close. Well, Burchett, so it gets, we can just go to massacre together. I sent a letter in April 2020 to then Treasury Secretary Mnuchin raising concerns about economic impact payments going to ineligible foreign nationals. And I and my Republican colleagues have tried to warn our friends across the aisle that we should not go blindly throwing money at this pandemic without oversight. Fortunately, I'm afraid they didn't listen. Does the GAO have details on the amount of payments that were incorrectly provided to ineligible foreign nationals or deceased individuals during the rush to send COVID checks to all corners of the world? I'm sure this has sort of been asked earlier, but
First, on deceased individuals, We looked at the work done by there's a tax inspector general there.
Right.
They found $1.4 billion sent to deceased individuals in the first round or first and second round of the economic incentive
Right.
payments.
Now, would you call that fraud or just mistakes or just people had
That-
died since that had gone on?
It's a mistake. It's a
Okay.
mistake.
Wow.
And actually, IRS interpreted it that Congress intended them to do that. So it wasn't until Treasury stepped in and said that that was inappropriate. And we recommended they try to get that money back. And they did receive about half of it back.
Okay. Do you agree with the assessment that several experts and some government officials at different levels, they've indicated that there was so much fraud in the COVID relief because of the lack of clear guidance? And that was done by Congress, obviously, amid the rush to give away taxpayer dollars.
That was a contributing factor, particularly at the PPP level. But I think the main things were self-certification, lack of supporting documentation.
Right.
And actually, the CARES Act prohibited the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program from using tax transcripts to compare against the loans.
Wow.
And so now Congress fixed these things later, but those things affected the unemployment insurance program too.
Right.
Congress gave an incentive for states to waive some of the requirements by giving them additional money to do it.
The
So,
cow was already out of the barn, as they say. So it was,
the cow, the pig, the chicken, and
yeah, the whole barnyard.
Right.
So, because of that lack of clear guidance, have we learned anything? Do we have the proper things in place to stop that from happening again, or are we? And I'm run out of time. If you
Yeah.
can just give me a quick one, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, no, we're starting to move, but it's slow. Yeah, but much more needs to be done to be better prepared next time.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all. I know y'all probably woke up this morning and thought, wow, I'm going to go before Congress. It's going to be great. And now you're still here.
The gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Although I served on this committee last Congress, I'm excited to bring much needed accountability to Washington for the first time in over 2 years. My Republican colleagues and I are committed to returning this committee to its proper role of rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement in the federal government, and that commitment starts today. In the span of 1 year, Congress passed upwards of $4.6 trillion in the form of economic stimulus bills and expanded eligibility for federal relief programs like unemployment insurance. When communities across America started to recover from the pandemic, Congress continued to saturate states with millions of taxpayer dollars under the guise of COVID-19 relief without the means to distribute it efficiently or safely. A Kansas audit showed that my home state may have made hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent payments when state agency systems were overwhelmed by an unprecedented number of claimants. As recently as last September, the Department of Justice charged 47 people with using the Federal Child Nutrition Program in Minnesota to siphon $250 million. And it's no secret that many states abuse these funds to alter school curriculum, give illegal immigrants stimulus checks, and advance green energy initiatives. Public trust in our government is at an all-time low, and we cannot expect that to change if we continue this poor stewardship of Americans' tax dollars. I think Congress can do better, and I look forward to discussing with our witnesses how to avoid this level of fraud and waste of taxpayer dollars in the future. Mr. Dodaro, and I'll ask the same question of the other two witnesses. Your institution is tasked with monitoring administrative agencies and providing recommendations for improvement. Per GAO's website and the testimony we've heard, fraud detection is a difficult task. Can GAO ascribe a monetary cost to conducting fraud detection and retroactive certification of payments? If not, can you describe the potential opportunity cost to the taxpayer of directing agency attention toward auditing massive COVID payments after they're distributed?
It's much more efficient to prevent the fraud from occurring in the first place. That's why we worked with Congress back in 2015, 2016 to pass the Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act, so put in place a framework that we developed for best practices on how to prevent fraud in the first place. Much more efficient, much more effective.
Mr. Horowitz?
Yes, I'd say the same thing. We talked about this earlier, about the recovery rate when the money's already gone. and you have to chase it down. It's a 10, 12% rate, I think Mr. Dodaro indicated. Keep in mind, money, for example, that goes overseas, takes a long time to try and track that down if you ever can. And so that's the challenge. There is no better way to eliminate or reduce fraud rates than to detect it and prevent it at the outset.
Mr. Smith, the winner of the easiest name award on the panel today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's.
I agree with my colleagues. The Secret Service, prior to the pandemic, is in the business of mitigating financial crimes and fraud. I mentioned earlier that that's in our DNA, if you will. We do advanced work because we know criminals are nonstop in their efforts in trying to defraud Americans, whether before the pandemic or not.
Let's stay with you. You worked with government entities like the Small Business Administration, the Department of Labor, ahead of the enactment of the pandemic relief funding to explore strategies to address what you describe as a, quote, a looming wave of potentially fraudulent activity. Drawing from your experience tracking fraud in federal relief programs, what could the government have done to better support states and entities in charge of dispersing funds?
What could we have done to support the states?
Correct.
So one of the things I mentioned earlier was putting out alerts. So our cyber fraud task forces and our Global Investigative Operations Center, which is the hub of all of our task forces, submitted alerts, GIOC alerts, if you will, to 30,000 plus financial institutions and to those partners. What we were doing was sharing indicators of compromise with those entities, such as if an individual was using an IP address that was from an overseas originating point, or if a financial institution saw, if you happen to see an account being opened fairly recently and that account was being used to move a substantial amount of money in a short period of time, that will be something you would flag. So one of the things we did at the beginning of the pandemic and even prior was sharing information and indicators of compromise that we're seeing not only from other entities, but from criminals themselves. Because keep in mind, as a federal law enforcement entity, we do work with criminals. We have confidential informants, and we get information from the inside, if you will, regarding what tactics are afoot.
Thank you. And the committee thanks all three of you for being here today and doing a great job answering questions. At this time, we're going to pause and change out the panels.
information.
23
And
million U.S.
they said,
workers were
just don't do
unemployed.
anything, don't say anything.
Congress
This is
stepped
just
up
before
to
the
pass six
election.
bills which created programs that literally saved lives and livelihoods and prevented what could have been a prolonged and devastating economic collapse. This robust policy response helped to make the COVID recession the shortest on record and contributed to an economic recovery that has brought the unemployment rate from a high of 14.7% in 2020 to 3.5% today. Indeed, according to Moody's Analytics, without these programs, the economy would have succumbed to a double-dip recession. A combination of well-designed social insurance programs drove poverty to the lowest level on record in 2021, cutting the number of poor children by nearly half and keeping over 25 million people out of poverty. One important piece of the protections enacted by Congress were the pandemic unemployment insurance programs that not only contributed to the historic reductions in poverty in 2020 and 2021, but they also broadly supported recipients' financial stability and overall well-being, filling in the substantial gaps in the nation's inadequate UI system. UI is particularly effective at getting money into the hands of consumers who need it and who will spend it quickly, and this supports businesses and in their communities and stabilizes state economies. Unfortunately, a decades-long failure to properly invest in the administration of the UI system made it an appealing target for organized crime during the pandemic. Chronically underfunded and understaffed state UI systems operating with antiquated technology were tasked with building and implementing a major new set of federal programs with little advanced preparation. This resulted in multiple points of vulnerability for criminal enterprises, which had previously stolen the identities of workers during private sector data breaches. They seized upon this pandemic as a time to use those stolen identities to fraudulently obtain UI benefits. As the temporary federal pandemic programs had to be built virtually overnight, state agencies were not able to design systems to protect against identity fraud in these programs. As detailed in my written testimony, Department of Labor has had a notable recent successes in pioneering national fraud prevention solutions and enlisting state participation. Using funds from the American Rescue Plan, DOL has made substantial investments in strengthening state systems to detect and prevent future identity fraud. DOL Tiger teams, equity grants, and IT modernization assistance all combine a focus on improving access to UI for eligible workers with resources and expertise to combat fraudulent activity. DOL also offers a wide range of technical and system support for state fraud prevention, detection, and recovery. State participation in the Integrity Data Hub and the use of its cross-match systems have increased significantly since the pandemic, with more states using DOL's Identity Verification Service, Incarceration Data Exchange, and recently launched Bank Account Verification Service that enables states to thwart ID fraud by verifying that a bank account belongs to the worker claiming benefits. Moreover, states can no longer bring in contractors to help run their programs, as they were given emergency flexibility to do so during the height of the pandemic. GAO noted that a major cause of increased identity fraud was the insufficient number of state UI staff and the fact that new staff were severely undertrained. Although intended to handle a historic increase in claims, inexperienced and insufficiently trained contract staff, through no fault of their own, both contributed to increased fraudulent activity and created greater obstacles for workers who were seeking benefits. As for the outdated IT systems used by so many state programs, Congress has provided much-needed increases in federal funding for UI administration and worker-centered technology modernization over the past 2 years. Congress must continue making these investments because sophisticated criminal enterprises will continue to seek vulnerabilities in state systems, and state agencies will need to keep pace. In conclusion, the pandemic relief that Congress enacted combined to provide critical lifeline to workers, families, and communities and the nation's economy. I hope that this committee will recognize the tremendous value of COVID relief programs and work together to find meaningful solutions to the ever-evolving problem of identity fraud that has undermined their effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dixon. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since this is our first committee hearing of this Congress, I want to express my hope that this committee will, on a bipartisan basis, find ways to strengthen federal programs and serve everyday working people. I truly want to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make life better for all our constituents, including mine back home in Ohio. In that spirit, I want to share some real-life stories of people in Ohio who have benefited from some of the life-saving pandemic relief programs we are discussing today. Here is an example. Tiffany from Northeast Ohio said, and I quote, "I was laid off on March 13, 2020. Even though it took a month to begin receiving my unemployment benefits, I am so thankful for them. Without them, my family of four wouldn't have anything at all coming in. The extra federal money per week enabled me to pay my bills and helped me to provide for my children in such a traumatic situation." Tiffany's testimony is just one example among millions in all our districts, urban or rural, dense or sparse, rich or poor, for whom this federal assistance made all the difference. Ms. Dixon, how did COVID-19 relief legislation such as the Bipartisan CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan save American families from disaster?
So one thing we know is that the economy is 70% consumer spending. Consumer spending drives our economy. And with 23 million workers out of work, there would have been an enormous contraction of spending, which would have then sent us into a double-dip recession. It also prevented hunger and homelessness, and really allowed families to focus on caregiving for their sick family members. And it was just really a lifeline, a critical, important way that Congress came through for working families.
Thank you very much. So it is clear to me that the Biden administration and Congress took decisive action to provide relief for the American people. The critical and much needed investments in health and economic programs are helping the country recover and bounce back from the worst pandemic in recent memory. So let us not forget that. And we are continuing to emerge stronger than ever. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Vermont, Ms. Ballant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. As you know, Ms. Dixon, in March and April of 2020, we experienced really an unprecedented economic shock. 22 million people lost their jobs. Millions of people suddenly found themselves without an income. And in April in 2020, when I was a leader in the Vermont Senate, we saw Vermont's seasonally adjusted unemployment rate go up to 15.6%, which was up 12% from the year before. So thankfully, Congress stepped in and helped us to expand the unemployment insurance. And as you said, and as others have said, it was an absolute lifeline for families and individuals. So my question is, without unemployment insurance programs, how would individuals and families be able to respond to such an economic crisis? Like, what happens without these kinds of funds to allow individuals and families to stay afloat?
It's not necessarily well known, but the unemployment insurance is the first line of defense against poverty and homelessness. It is the only universal cash program that we have that provides cash to working families when they lose a job. There is nothing else. And what we saw in the Great Recession when folks were exhausting their benefits is the other program that they turned to was the SNAP program. And there really was nothing else. And so it just can't be stressed enough how critical this program is to making sure that families can maintain while they search for work.
I really appreciate that distinction. And I think we can't overstress it. I know for me, having worked directly with individuals and families, thousands of Vermonters, that is exactly what I was hearing from my own constituents. So when we think about unemployment insurance programs and how they assist workers in job searches, do job searches change when an individual is benefiting from an unemployment insurance benefit?
The benefit has many important qualities. One is that it allows workers to actually match with jobs that match their skills. So they're not trying to take the first possible thing that is offered to them, which is not good for the economy because those folks' skills are being unused. So it does give them the breathing room to find a good match that is going to be close to the salary that they were receiving before they lost their job.
And I would assume that not only would those skills go unused, but when you have a worker who is mismatched, they're much less likely to stay in that job. So exacerbating this cycle of turnover, which we know is not good for employers, it's not good for employees or families. And is that the case? Do we see that there's a connection there with job churn?
There absolutely is. And, you know, we've heard employers loud and clear, particularly in some of the industries that were hardest hit in the pandemic, the service industry, the restaurant industry, where workers have actually left those industries entirely to go to other industries because better conditions and better pay. And so if a worker takes a job, we want them to actually be able to stay in that job, advance in that job. So it's important to them and their families, just as it's important to employers to have stability in the role that they're in.
Thank you. Just one more question. From your perspective, from your experience and your research and the work that you do in your position, why do you think we need to continue to invest in and modernize state unemployment insurance systems? Because we heard in the earlier testimony how there was a breakdown there. So would love to hear from you, from your perspective, why that is so important.
So about a decade ago, I did a report that was a deep dive on unemployment insurance administration and the impact on being able to pay benefits. And what I found then was that the average UI benefits IT system was 26 years old. That was 10 years ago. And at the time, the oldest one was 46 years old. And so it is critical for us to invest, to actually put the money in. So usually when there's a crisis like this pandemic, there's investment in unemployment, there's investment in the IT systems, there's investment in administration, but then as soon as the economy recovers, we take our foot off the gas. And we really need to keep our foot on the gas for this program. We need to actually make the changes that are needed so that these systems function correctly all the time, whether it is one family who's suffering unemployment or it is millions of people suffering unemployment.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Bush.
Thank you. St. Louis and I are here in support of a government that ensures no one lives in poverty. During March and April of 2020, the U.S. economy lost more than 22 million jobs. Our unemployment rate jumped from 3.5% in January 2020 to a pandemic peak unemployment rate of 14.7% in April 2020. St. Louis families and families all across the country were in need of emergency assistance during those uncertain times. One such story, shared by the National Employment Law Project, comes from my constituent, Deshauna, a single mother from St. Louis. She said, "If it wasn't for unemployment, I would have been put out of my apartment. Thank God for the help. I'm still trying to get myself out of debt, but the pandemic unemployment gives me and my son a little security. I'm a single parent getting no help from the other parent, plus losing my job. So it has definitely been a blessing." The CARES Act created a temporary unemployment insurance program called the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, or the PUA. In 2020, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan into law, which extended PUA and other temporary unemployment insurance benefits. The PUA unlocked unemployment insurance benefits to workers and to families who were otherwise excluded from regular UI programs. This program was the difference between a full dinner table and an empty one for a number of families. Ms. Dixon, who benefited the most from these programs, and can you tell us why? And thank you for being here.
So the unemployment insurance program was created 80 plus years ago, and it has not been substantially modernized. And it was created on a structurally racist foundation that was aimed at white male breadwinners. And so if that's the foundation, that's who mostly benefits from unemployment insurance. And so that means women workers, folks who work part-time. It means people who work in restaurants and service jobs where their wages are low. They often are just entirely left out of the program. And most workers who are in gig jobs are also excluded from the program. So as the workforce has changed over time, many workers have been left on the sidelines. And particularly this impacts women and workers of color. And so adding this program actually invited them into the program, some for the first time in their working lives.
Thank you. In August 2020, the Department of Labor announced that it would distribute up to $260 million in grants to states to address disparities in the service delivery and administration of state unemployment insurance systems and promote equitable access to benefits. Ms. Dixon, how have the Department of Labor's equity grants impacted local communities across our country?
One of the most critical things to understand when folks are doing this work in the states, they want to pay benefits. So they are not standing in the way. They are actually working really hard when they're understaffed and underinvested in. And one of the things that the Equity Grant Program has helped is for those folks to understand what the impacts are of the way the program is designed, so that it's not necessarily the individuals and the actions that they're taking, but it's the system and how they need to change what they do to help offset the inequities in the system. And that has been a really critical piece for states to take to heart as they are working to serve unemployed workers.
Thank you. Sadly, Republicans are so focused on cutting programs that benefit regular, everyday people that it is impossible to take their criticisms of these programs seriously. We need to ensure funds are being used properly and then expand these programs and expand them permanently. Democrats will continue to lead with bold legislation that tackles our nation's crises while advancing equity and equal opportunity. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you so much, Ms. Dixon, for your testimony. On the last panel, we discussed my time at the state legislature in Pennsylvania, where we heard intimate struggles of Americans that they faced throughout the pandemic. They often had to choose whether to pay their rent or their child care, as we know. And we also know that these conditions are unacceptable. Ms. Dixon, I understand all states approach unemployment differently. Based on your research, is there an ideal state system we could learn from here in Congress?
So rather than an ideal state system, the thing that Congress could do is create a universal baseline that is federal standards that every state has to meet. Right now, depending on the state that you happen to be unemployed in, you may receive a benefit as low as $235 a week as the maximum, or you may receive eligibility for as low as 12 weeks of payment, as opposed to 26 weeks in other states. And so that doesn't make any sense that we would have this patchwork of programs if we really want to make sure and we're serious about coming through for unemployed workers when they need us the most. And so having a baseline of standards where there's a minimum 26 weeks that all states have to pay, where there are minimum number of a dollar amount that fits what the state's economy is, that there is a minimum set of eligibility standards that fits all workers. We need that, and we need that crucially. We also need an extended benefits program that turns on automatically and just triggers on when there's a crisis, so that workers are not waiting for congressional action, but they can rely on their programs to just spring into action.
Thank you. We talked about how some different workers or different people were benefited more from some of these programs. Could you elaborate on the disparate impact the pandemic had on communities of color that you shared in your testimony?
Yes. So our labor market is very stratified. And by stratified, I mean that women make up the largest portion of low-wage workers, and people of color also. And those jobs were actually really hit hard in this pandemic. And so those folks lost their jobs, But because of history, they also don't have wealth accumulated in savings. And so the fact that these programs that Congress took action so quickly and was able to get the money out the door, it meant a lot to folks who did not have savings to rely on and for whom this program made the difference between being able to pay rent and stay in their homes.
Thank you. Lastly, where would we have been without these programs? In other words, what would have happened to the millions of individuals who relied on these programs during the pandemic without them?
We would have had incredible child poverty and a tsunami of evictions and many other ills that we were able to avoid. And that was really great for children, for families, and communities. And Congress really came through for working people in this program. And it is something that we will feel the positive effects of for generations. When families are in poverty, it's very hard on children. It's hard on the mental health of parents if they don't have income. And so there is a payoff beyond just the actual monetary amount that happens in families that we will be reaping the benefits of for generations to come.
Thank you for your testimony and for your answers. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Goldman from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Dixon, for being here with us today. I'm from New York. New York State experienced its first COVID-19 case on March 1st, 2020, and I actually got COVID myself on March 10th, very early on. New York was at the epicenter of the pandemic at the beginning, and more than 78,000 New Yorkers have died as a result of COVID. As families in New York endured record unemployment throughout the pandemic, the unemployment insurance system became a lifeline to nearly 5 million New Yorkers. In my district, organizations like the Chinese American Planning Council connected at least 740 households with unemployment insurance, nearly 2,000 families with housing assistance, and more than 1,300 people who were excluded from federal relief programs got aid through New York City's innovative Immigrant Emergency Relief Program. And that's just one outstanding organization of many. When COVID surged and 22 million people lost their job, it fell to our unemployment insurance system to take on the immense volume of new claims. New York's Department of Labor distributed more than $105 billion, which is the equivalent of 50 years' worth of benefits in the 2 years from the start of the pandemic. But obviously, this new influx of benefits opened itself up to fraud, especially through identity theft online, which I know you have spoken about. The New York State Department of Labor has recommended that Congress provide sustained investments and additional resources to help states combat the ever-evolving threat of cyber fraud. And Ms. Dixon, I'm curious what you think Congress should do to assist states, separate from the sort of federal baseline that you talked about. Where would our resources be most effective in assisting states to modernize and upgrade its unemployment insurance systems?
I'm echoing folks from the first panel. The information technology investments are critical. We have a decentralized system. There are 53 different unemployment insurance programs, and so there are 53 opportunities for criminal fraud rings to attack the system. And so really being able to invest in those systems, to harden those systems, to make sure that those offices are staffed. And one other really critical thing that Congress could do is create a program like the Extended Benefit Program that actually can be pre-programmed and already have the fraud measures built into it so that when there's a crisis, it just triggers on. And states are ready and they're not rushing to program a different program each time that there's a crisis.
Thank you. One of the most, I think, productive and effective measures that Congress passed was the child tax credit. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the success of the child tax credit and why it was so successful at reducing child poverty.
So one piece of it was that money actually went into families' bank accounts. and they did not have to wait until they filed their taxes to get this money. And so when you add that money together with the unemployment insurance payments, you have families actually getting cash to meet their needs at a critical time. And we see that in the reduction of poverty, like what the huge impact that was to families and children all over the United States.
And you're drawing a distinction between the earned income tax credit, which comes when you're paying your taxes, as opposed to cash in direct deposited or sent to you by check, you know, in that moment. Is that what you're saying?
No, so the child tax credit is also generally not paid on a monthly basis the way it was in this instance. So it generally is something that either folks are changing their tax withholding to account for, or they're waiting until they file their taxes to get it. So what was really revolutionary was actually giving the cash, putting the cash in families' bank accounts.
And in my final seconds, can you talk especially about how important that child tax credit was to underserved communities and people of color in particular?
Well, we know that those families are the ones who are hit the hardest in this pandemic, but they're also sort of chronically hit the hardest because they're in the lowest paying jobs. And so to make sure that children actually have their needs met, this was critical. And it was critical. It would have been critical at any time, but it was especially critical during this pandemic. And it would be great if Congress could figure out how to reinstate it, because the impact was just phenomenal for families.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It can be difficult to remember given all that has happened in the last 3 years, but I'd like us to envision ourselves back in those first few months of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. In March and April of 2020 alone, the economy lost more than 22 million jobs, and the unemployment rate skyrocketed to 14.7%. Jobs in sectors that are absolutely essential to the American economy were threatened. But after the CARES Act, states were able to put in place expanded unemployment insurance programs to assist workers who had lost their jobs. And census data shows that these expanded benefits kept approximately 5.5 million people out of poverty in 2020. Ms. Dixon, I'm curious about, from your vantage point, how expanded unemployment insurance played out as such a vital lifeline for workers as well as states during the pandemic.
So one of the reasons that Congress put in place these programs is because the unemployment insurance program in the states is inadequate. Inadequate in who it covers, inadequate in how much the weekly benefit amount is. And so when Congress added $600 a week and then $300, that was amazing, especially in states where the average benefit is only, the national average benefit is only $300 a week. And so this made it possible for folks to stay in their homes. They didn't have to choose between food and gas in their cars. It was critical. And I think that, like, part of what we have to do is learn from the successes. So we've talked a lot about instances where there was identity theft and fraud, but we haven't talked about the amazing number of folks who got UI for the first time and what it meant for them and their ability to stay attached to the workforce. And so I think we really have to mine the data on the good pieces and figure out what we can carry forward and what Congress can do to actually carry those pieces forward as a minimum standard for states to implement.
Absolutely. Thank you for that information, because you know, for so much in this hearing, there's a constant focus not just on the notion of the pandemic response being fraudulent or wasteful, but it seems as though a particular fixation on the unemployment program, which, as you stated, if it weren't for the federal unemployment supplemental program, families would have been potentially enduring months of unemployment and having to just scrounge by on as little as $300 a week. And especially when it comes to skyrocketing costs of housing, would it be also in your assessment that this could have also potentially, without that federal response, dramatically expanded the amount of housing insecurity and people who may even be struggling with homelessness if it weren't for that supplemental?
It absolutely did. Because even though there were also things that Congress created that were housing supplements and assistance, it did take a while to get out. And the UI program is the quickest way to get money into the pockets of workers. And so this really did have a critical influence on being able to stay in homes and for folks to be able to pay their rent and to not, and there was an eviction moratorium, but it also means that they're not sitting there with $10,000 of back rent that they can never pay. So it just kept them, it kept them going in a way that made sure that they weren't incurring debt to actually try to just do their basic living expenses.
Absolutely. And despite experiencing the worst job losses, the United States experiencing the worst job losses since the Great Depression during that early COVID period, the COVID-19 recession was also the shortest on record. But to expand on this point that you're making, how did these pandemic relief programs, particularly unemployment insurance, help stabilize the economy even from a more macro perspective?
So because so much of our economy is based on consumer spending, that's the first thing that families cut back on. And so we know it's kind of like it's an unvirtuous cycle. So there's an economic downturn, there's a contraction, and it just gets worse and worse. And so the UI program actually did what it was designed to do, which was to stabilize the economy, to stabilize communities and state economies, and to prevent that downward spiral, and to prevent a double dip recession, which we had some experience with a pretty terrible recession not that long ago. And so just being able to get through this pandemic without that protracted recession and also without that protracted high unemployment rate.
So thank you, and I yield back to the chair.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Dixon, welcome. I've got a question that's triggered by something that you said, which is, well, why did our unemployment insurance system grow up in such a way that it's decentralized in the 50 states rather than being one national program? Because it seems like the problems are just legion with doing it that way.
So the reason is because the Southern planter class in the 1930s would not have approved a program of that nature. There were actually proposals to make it a universal program, to make it paid for out of general fund dollars, and those were not adopted because the Southern states did not want people of color, Black people in particular, to have access to this program. They wanted the control to be able to decide who qualifies and who does not.
I mean, to my mind, it's almost like having 50 different Social Security programs or 50 different Medicare programs, right? We've just been through a period where we've seen the brokenness of a system that is that decentralized. So, well, thank you for clarifying that for me. The bottom line here is that expanded unemployment insurance, even with these dysfunctional, antiquated state systems, allowed millions of people to fill in financial gaps in their lives at a time of unprecedented difficulty and loss. Would you share a few examples with us of how expanded unemployment insurance benefited the people that you work with?
So though we don't directly represent workers, I do get emails from workers who don't know that, and often I can refer them to legal representation. But it is very, very satisfying when the email that you get from a worker is about how grateful they are that this program is in place, that this program got extended, and that they are able to focus on their family and their livelihood. And so getting those kinds of emails from workers, it really does fill my soul and makes me want to show up every day to do this job. And so workers were really organizing around these benefits. They were active, they were engaged, and it's been critical and phenomenal that they had these benefits to cover their basic needs in this once in a century crisis.
Gotcha. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us before you go?
don't take your foot off the gas in supporting UI administrative funding and providing support for upgrading IT systems and all of the things. On behalf of working people, really grateful for the way that Congress came through, and just hope that you all, with what you've heard today from me and from the other panel, will take seriously the need to invest in the infrastructure of this program so that it can function well without Congress having to step in when there's a crisis or just when there's a personal crisis for a family.
Well, thank you for your wonderful testimony and for your commitment to the cause. And Mr. Chairman, I will yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back. Before we adjourn this hearing, I would like to introduce our 5 subcommittee chairs on behalf of Chairman Comer. Congresswoman Nancy Mace will chair the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Government Innovation. Congressman Pat Fallon will chair the Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Energy Policy, and Regulatory Affairs. Congressman Pete Sessions will chair the Subcommittee on Government Operations and the Federal Workforce. Congresswoman Lisa McClain will chair the Subcommittee on Healthcare and Financial Services. And Congressman Glenn Grothman will chair the Subcommittee on National Security, the Border, and Foreign Affairs. I yield to the ranking member for introduction of his subcommittee ranking members.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Connolly will be our ranking member on the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, IT, and Government Innovation. Ms. Bush will be our ranking member on Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Energy Policy, and Regulatory Affairs. Mr. Mfume will be the ranking member on Government Operations and the Workforce. Mr. Krishnamurthy will be the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Healthcare and Financial Services, and Ms. Porter will be ranking member on National Security, the Border, and Foreign Affairs.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution naming the 5 subcommittee chairs and the 5 ranking members is approved. In closing, I want to thank our panelists once again for their important and insightful testimony today. I also want to thank my colleagues for participating in our first oversight hearing of the 118th Congress, an oversight hearing that goes to the very heart of this committee's jurisdiction, protecting taxpayer dollars from fraud, waste, and abuse. With that, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. With that, our hearing is adjourned.